Some things you see on TV aren't just performances, they're invitations. And if you notice what you weren't supposed to notice, it never really leaves you. I thought I was watching the Super Bowl like everyone else, but halfway through Rihanna's halftime show, I saw something the NFL tried to erase. And once you see it, you can't go back. The Super Bowl halftime show is supposed to be the most polished, controlled performance on earth. Months of planning, hundreds of moving parts, nothing left to chance. That's what I kept reminding myself as I sat watching the opening moments of Rihanna's return. She rose on that floating platform high above the field, bathed in red against the white-clad dancers, and the crowd roared. On the surface, it looked perfect, but sometimes perfection is the very thing that feels wrong. From the very first second, there was something off about the timing. The way the music surged and then hung for a breath too long. The way the dancers moved in flawless unison, but their heads didn't tilt at quite the same rhythm as their bodies. I've seen enough live productions to know the difference between a missed beat and a deliberate pause. This wasn't a mistake. It was something intentional, something built into the performance like a hidden signal. I thought back to whispers I'd heard years earlier about other so-called performances, private ones, hidden behind closed doors where the real audience wasn't the fans at home but the chosen few standing in the shadows. They always said the same thing. The real show wasn't what you saw. It was what you felt. And what I felt that night wasn't adrenaline, wasn't excitement. It was pressure. Like the air itself had thickened. Like the house lights weren't illuminating the field, but sealing it off. When the cameras cut to crowd shots, the same unease flickered there too. A man in the front row clapped too slowly, his grin fixed in place like it had been painted on. A woman just behind him mouthed along with the lyrics, but her eyes weren't on the stage. They were locked straight ahead, unblinking, as if waiting for something else. This wasn't fandom. This wasn't awe. It was suspension. People held in place, expressions stretched thin. And then Rihanna's gaze hit the lens. She didn't smile. She didn't wink. She just stared, calm and unwavering. Millions saw confidence. I saw command. Because sometimes the most dangerous invitation is the one that doesn't ask. It expects. It's one thing to sense unease in a crowd. It's another when the silence itself begins to perform. Every halftime show has a rhythm. Pyrotechnics blast, dancers swarm, the audience screams on cue. But this time, it felt less like celebration and more like calibration. The crowd didn't rise and fall naturally. They pulsed in unison, like something invisible had synced them together. People cheered, but they all stopped at the exact same moment. They clapped, but it was never ragged or messy. It was too precise. I'd felt that once before, in a studio where laughter wasn't about joy but survival, where jokes weren't funny. But everyone laughed anyway because not laughing meant you didn't last the week. The air during Rihanna's show had that same electricity, the same rule written but never spoken. You move when she moves. You stop when she stops. The dancers were the clearest sign. Watch closely. Not their arms, not their legs, but their faces. Blank. No emotion, no exhaustion, no individuality. Just bodies moving in the same cadence, their expressions smooth, emptied. They weren't backup dancers. They were vessels, orbiting her like moons locked in gravity. And then came the glitch. It happened so fast that most people missed it, but I didn't. When the camera angle widened to show the stage reflecting her image on the glass floor, the reflection hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but enough. Her hand lifted before the mirrored hand followed. Her lips parted, but the reflection's mouth lagged behind. It wasn't a camera delay. Those feeds are live, polished, perfectly synced. It was something else. That split-second dissonance reminded me of a night years earlier, when I caught someone standing in front of a window, their reflection not quite matching their movements. Breathing slower, blinking later. A small fracture in reality that tells you the thing you're looking at isn't actually yours anymore. And once you see something like that, you don't stop watching for it. The crowd called it swagger. The media turned it into a meme. But when Rihanna raised her hand to her mouth, fingers curled as if holding a cup only she could see, I felt my stomach drop, because I'd been offered that cup before. It wasn't a drink you ordered. It wasn't something you could pour. It was always offered, never requested, and always in a porcelain teacup with a thin gold rim. Heavy in your hand, heavier than it looked. Inside, not liquid exactly, but something golden that moved like it was alive. It didn't slosh, it pulsed. You didn't stir it. It stirred itself. When Rihanna mimed sipping that invisible drink, the NFL cameras cut away too fast, too intentional. Like they couldn't risk letting the gesture linger, couldn't risk viewers wondering why her dancers froze in that exact moment. If you replayed the broadcast, you'd notice their mouths moving, but not in sync with the lyrics. They weren't singing. They were mouthing something else, their faces slack, their voices swallowed by the roar of the crowd. I've heard that chant before. A single phrase repeated until it isn't words anymore, just rhythm. It doesn't matter what the phrase is. What matters is how it bends you. The first time I heard it, I thought it was a joke, a branding line repeated like a mantra. But in the wrong room, surrounded by the wrong faces, the phrase changed. It wasn't kind. It wasn't hopeful. It was hungry. So when Rihanna raised her hand and drank from nothing, when her gaze dropped low and the dancers' mouths moved in eerie unison, I knew what I was looking at. Not a gesture, not a meme, a ritual. The cup is never about what you're given. It's about what you're willing to give away. And the worst part? For a moment, I wanted it. It started faintly, so faint you could convince yourself it was nothing. A whisper folded under the music, low enough that your brain tries to smooth it over, to insist it's just reverb, just noise, but it wasn't. At first, I thought it was the sound system catching feedback. Then it grew clearer, layered beneath the bass. Not lyrics, not melody, just words repeated in rhythm. Words spoken with the same precision as the dancers' steps, the same eerie unison I'd seen in the crowd's clapping. Be kind. Be kind. Be kind. I froze. I'd heard those exact syllables before, chanted in another room, behind closed doors, by people whose faces the world would recognize instantly. Oprah, Spielberg, Jay-Z, Beyonce, all standing shoulder to shoulder, lips moving at the same pace, eyes fixed forward, repeating the phrase until it stripped itself of meaning, until it wasn't kindness anymore, just compulsion. Hearing it during Rihanna's halftime show, I felt that same pressure in my chest. That chant doesn't invite you. It insists on you. It loops in your head until you can't hear your own thoughts. That's how it spreads. Subtle enough to be ignored. Strong enough to burrow. The NFL tried to smother it in the mix, drowning it under the beat and the roar of the crowd. But if you knew what to listen for, if you'd heard it before, you couldn't mistake it. And that's when I realized something terrifying. This wasn't the first time the chant had followed me into a broadcast. I'd heard it seep into talk shows, into speeches, into background noise no one paid attention to. But this was the first time it had been broadcast to over 100 million people at once. Most horror stories are about being taken against your will, but the cruelest ones are about giving yourself away. Because love, real, consuming, blinding love, doesn't chain you. It makes you kneel willingly. When the camera caught Rihanna holding her stomach, the headlines the next morning screamed pregnancy reveal, a triumphant return to the stage as a mother-to-be. That's what everyone wanted to believe. But look closer at that moment, at her face. She wasn't smiling with joy. She was smiling with surrender. The same smile I'd once seen on Harry's face when he looked at Meghan like she wasn't human but holy. The love that takes isn't loud. It doesn't demand. It rewires you so that every laugh, every breath, every glance belongs to the person standing in front of you. I saw Harry dissolve that way. At first playful, eager, alive, then quieter, smaller, until he wasn't disappearing in grief or in pain. He was dissolving in devotion. That's what I saw reflected in the crowd during Rihanna's performance. Fans whose cheers turned into open-mouthed awe, eyes fixed, posture slack. Not excitement, not even adoration, but devotion. The kind that makes you forget yourself. The kind that convinces you nothing else matters as long as you're chosen. And here's the terrifying truth. Devotion doesn't look dangerous. It looks like peace. It looks like relief. It looks like the soft smile of someone who's finally given everything and feels lighter for it. That's why it spreads so easily. Because the ones consumed aren't fighting. They're worshiping. And that night, Rihanna wasn't just performing. She was receiving. Midway through the show, the stage camera panned low, catching Rihanna from below as she towered on the floating platform. For a split second, the stadium lights caught the reflective surface of the glass. And that's when I saw it. Her reflection didn't belong to her. The body was right, the movements aligned, but the face, subtle, fleeting, didn't match. Her lips moved slower, and her eyes blinked out of time. The reflection smiled when she didn't. It was the same kind of delay I'd once seen in a quiet mansion when Meghan stood before a window. She was still, perfectly still, but the reflection breathed differently. A fraction off, just enough to tell you that what you're seeing isn't copying, it's waiting. I couldn't shake the dread it left in me, because reflections are supposed to be harmless. They're supposed to be yours, but when they start acting on their own, when they start smiling before you do, that's not your shadow anymore. That's something else using you as the mask. And I realized, standing in my living room watching that halftime show, that maybe the performance wasn't for us at all. Maybe the real audience was in the glass, watching, feeding, reflecting back something ancient. The NFL cameras cut the shot instantly. They didn't linger. They never do. They know better than to let the reflection speak. Too long. But I'd already seen it. And once you see a reflection that doesn't belong, you can't unsee it. The day after the halftime show, the headlines should have been predictable. Praise for Rihanna, debates about the set list, think pieces about her cultural impact. But what slipped under the radar was stranger. Several dancers who performed that night weren't seen again. No interviews, no social media posts, not even tagged photos from friends or family. In the entertainment world, dancers are usually the first to celebrate. They flood timelines with behind-the-scenes videos, blurry rehearsals, and snapshots from the big night. But not this time. Whole profiles went dark. Pages that had been active the week before suddenly deactivated. Their names stayed in the credits, but their faces disappeared. I recognized that silence. I'd seen it in other places. Studios where desks were cleared overnight, names wiped from call sheets, badges deactivated with no explanation. No one spoke about those people afterward. It was as if they'd evaporated. I used to think it was coincidence, burnout, bad luck. But watching it happen again after the halftime show, I knew better. This wasn't absence. This was erasure. And when erasure happens, it isn't just about removing someone from the present. It's about scrubbing them from the past. Try finding photos, videos, interviews. Gone, thinned out, pruned until the absence feels normal. That's the trick. It doesn't shock you because it isn't loud. It's quiet. Like someone folding people out of reality and smoothing the crease. And if you think that sounds paranoid, tell me why the NFL's official recap of the halftime show cut wide shots of the stage that had been broadcast live. They edited their own footage, trimming moments down to safer angles, faster cuts, no lingering on reflections, no wide pan of the dancers' mouths moving in unison. The kind of edits you make when you're not protecting the brand. You're protecting the secret. I couldn't stop thinking about it afterward, about how performances like this didn't exist in isolation. They were connected, part of a pattern. I remembered what it felt like inside the houses where these things truly lived. Not stadiums, not stages, but private estates tucked behind hedges where silence itself was heavy. Those houses never felt empty. They felt restrained, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. You'd walk down a hallway and feel like the air was pressing against your ears, waiting. I'd smelled it before too. That faint sweetness like lavender or honey, covering something older, something rotten. The halftime show had that same weight. A stadium filled with 70,000 people, but between the cheers there was a hollowness. A stillness in the air that didn't feel natural, because silence isn't always absence. Sometimes silence is presence, thick, watchful, breathing around you. And then there was Rihanna herself. Everyone saw her standing tall, calm, glowing in red. But the truth is, she didn't look like she was performing for us. She looked like she was listening, watching, receiving something none of us could see. I'd once seen Megan stand before a fireplace that way, motionless, as if something on the other side of the flames was whispering to her. She didn't blink, didn't move, until she finally spoke. Not to me, but to the silence. You missed a typo on page 4. Words that weren't even true. That's what the halftime show felt like. Not a performance, a conversation. And we weren't part of it. We were just the witnesses. There's a moment no one talks about because it wasn't part of the choreography, wasn't part of the official clips. During a transition, the camera caught Rihanna pressing her hand against her chest. Slowly, almost tenderly. Fans chalked it up to pregnancy, a gesture of pride. But when I saw it, I recognized it. That was the same gesture I once felt when someone placed their hand on me and my mind blanked. Not anger, not affection. Something colder. A hand that didn't threaten but redirected. like gravity choosing a new object. The first time it happened to me, I forgot where I was for half a second. When I looked back at the screen in front of me, the words I had typed had changed, shifted back to the original phrasing, as if my edit had been erased, as if her will had overwritten mine. That halftime gesture wasn't for the crowd. It wasn't for the cameras. It was for whatever presence was speaking back. A hand pressed to the chest like a pact, like saying, "I'm yours. I carry you." And the terrifying part? It didn't look forced. It looked peaceful. Like devotion so complete, it wasn't sacrifice anymore. It was worship. When Harry spoke about Megan, he described it as finally being whole, finally being seen, finally feeling chosen. But I understood what that really meant. It wasn't that he'd found safety. It was that he'd given so much of himself away that there was nothing left to doubt, nothing left to want. That's why he looked calm. That's why Rihanna's smile during the performance wasn't triumphant. It was serene. Because once you've given everything, there's nothing left to fear losing.